ever got of walnuts?
Our friends from Pennsylvania brought me this device for gathering walnuts. With the tricky piece of brace wire clipped to the pail, it's a slick way to clean up a lawn and lay in a good supply of nuts with minimal bending. I gather about 50 gallons of nuts per year from this young tree. Why does it bear every year when many walnuts do not? It could be that it's growing out of the ruins of an old ash house. I think it's also because of the furnace in the house right behind it. On a still frosty night in late spring, when the walnut flowers are at their most vulnerable to low temperatures, that chimney pumps out a lot of heat. Years ago, my friend Neil Thomas analyzed the production of his walnut grove in Lansdowne. The trees closest to his house had by far the most nuts. This can be important if you're selecting a tree from which to gather seed. If you want seed from a yearly bearer, find one well away from the artificial heat sources, just to be sure. In 1965, the previous owner of this property had this area logged off for maple veneer logs. There were 3 old walnut trees on a fence line up at the other end of the sugar bush. The squirrels got busy in the clearings, and the walnuts started to grow. I found the first one that I could recognize in 1973, the day I graduated from university, actually. It was what I was pretty sure was a black walnut, 13 inches at the butt, and growing on a fence line over there. I phoned around, and everyone I phoned about black walnuts assured me it can't be a black walnut, it has to be a butternut because they don't grow here. Well, I persevered, and I found that it was in fact a black walnut, and so I decided I would make them my retirement project. Now, in the intervening time, that 13-inch small tree was 39 inches now, at least back in 2014 when I measured it. It's probably bigger than that now. In any case, they grow very well in this climate, and it's warmer here than it is on the north side of the woodlot. And I think that's why they grow here. The primary goal in the management plan was to increase the area of our woodlot to give it a deeper core. I chose to plant some walnuts. In the spring of 2006, the lead stewardship crew planted an acre of 3-year-old butternut seedlings from the nursery in Kemptville. They also brought along 100 5-year-old black walnuts from a site in Brockville. These plantings covered half of the field on a 20-foot grid. The idea was to run wagon tours for the plowing match through the sugar bush and around this field. That December, I planted the rest of the field and another 4 acres behind the barn with black walnuts gathered from 2 old trees along the fence row. The bare nuts sprouted and grew quite well in the first year, but a heavy crust the following winter broke off most of the tender saplings in this field. I thought they were dead and planted more. Then they all grew. Eventually the stems became robust enough to withstand the snow load, but this had set the field back several years in comparison to the stand behind the barn, which grows on a southern slope and did not have this problem. The lesson from this? Walnuts prefer slopes. The 15-year-old stand of walnuts you see here were planted at the same time as the ones in the back field, but here conditions were more to their liking. These trees have borne a good crop for the last 2 or 3 years. There are a couple of variables involved with the success of this stand. First, the southern slope away from the prevailing wind provides some shelter and extra sun. Second, there's considerable underground water movement from the upper level of the drumlin. But perhaps most importantly, when we took down an old barn at the top of this slope, the excavator dug a deep pit for unusable wood and the hay which was in the barn. That fire burned for a week, and then the operator covered it with soil. there's a deep and considerable deposit of wood ash just upstream from these trees. Their vigor and nut production reflect this. In 2008, I planted walnut seeds on a 20-foot grid. They weren't doing all that well, and so when the opportunity came up in 2010, I planted white pine trees on a 10-foot grid on top of the walnuts to use them as a nurse crop, because I read that this was something which would work. Since then, the walnuts have done quite well, and this is what you see. They were supposed to drive the walnuts up without allowing them to spread, but the walnuts weren't having any of that. They like to spread, so I have to prune them every year in order to keep them from becoming bushes. On the other hand, it makes for something interesting to do in the winter in a lovely sheltered area. And then I drive around after with my Kubota with a chipper on the back and make mulch of the lower branches. This shelter belt connects our woodlot to the rest of the forest on Young's Hill. The Leeds-Grenville Stewardship Council planted the first rows in 2005 in preparation for the International Plowing Match 2 years later. When I noticed walnuts growing among the pines, as much as a half mile from the nearest seed tree, I decided to help the squirrels out a bit with my planting stick. These skinny little walnut trees sticking up through the pine branches along here are an experiment. In this test plot, the seedlings don't need much pruning, that's for sure, and they certainly grow tall. Now, will some of them grow into veneer logs? We'll know in about 30 years or so. Okay. This is the Duke walnut cracker, which I ordered online from somewhere in Kentucky from the Duke Corporation. It generates quite a lot of force. My granddaughter and I separated out the parts that she ate from the shells, and we ended up calculating that a nut produces 25% edible meat, which actually tastes quite good. Highly flavored, but good. Behind me on my left is an area where there were a number of overaged maples growing and a lot of diseased beech. So Greg had to remove quite a lot of material from this area, creating quite a clearing. My plan is to replant that. Immediately I'll replant it with walnuts, although I may get some red oak to put in there as well. I have reason to believe that that will succeed, because if you see on my right a dense clump of trees, 12 years ago we planted, when we did the improvement cut for the woodlot, I ran across an article by Martin Straight in a magazine about encouraging the growth of red oak under forest cover by creating the conditions of a forest fire, by clearing out a section of the woods so that the sun could get in. So we planted that to red oak and cherry, and they grew. Except the maples, which had been waiting around for their chance, also grew really quickly, and the squirrels put in black walnuts. So we have quite a rich mixture and very dense tangle, which I have to clean out periodically with brush cutters to keep the maple from running over everything. In any case, I have every reason to believe that replanting this will provide young and heavy cover, although I notice that the emergent maples are doing their very best to cover up the whole area already. The problem for sugar making in the spring in this area is that the footing in the woods is very questionable for wheeled vehicles. This area, during the plowing match, had to have wagons going over it. And so they backed in trailer loads of gravel, 6-inch coarse stuff, and laid a significant road down as far as the top of this knoll, and on the far side, for a comparable distance, the effect of that was that we had good all-weather roads here to use utility vehicles to haul out sap. And so this is where we tapped. And we had a great time tapping up to 50 buckets and hauling them out to boil at the house over an open pan. Back about 2010, when there were lots of university students around, we had a great time. In 3 or 4 years, I'll be able to drive my little tractor through here pretty well anywhere, based upon my experience from the last harvest. The brush, when it's down low toward the ground like this, deteriorates quite quickly, and the vegetation simply comes back over the top as though it hadn't been there. You'll notice, if you look at the trees around here, they're bearing very few scars from the logging which went on here. That's a tribute to the logger. Greg Beach did a really good job on this. Pretty soon after Greg had left the woodlot, a young pair of red-tailed hawks started building this nest. And they occupied it when it was about half the size that it is now. And over the summer, I noticed that the nest had grown to at least double the size, and there's every evidence of activity around the nest. So I think we have ourselves a long-term red-tailed hawk nest as a direct result of this clearing. Now, the problem with dealing with beech which are diseased and have been cut is the problem of the beech tree. As it gets stressed, it puts up suckers around the rim of the tree to try to keep itself alive. That's a disease, that little round red spot. The white mark is the scab from the insect which starts the whole thing, but the actual killing disease is the red jelly. Now here's the worst thing that happens. When the tree starts to decline, it sends up suckers, and eventually the whole understory gets filled with beech shrubs which have no future potential. So we need to cut these sooner rather than later, or our maple woodlot will become a beech woodlot. You may see on the ground around me here, there are quite a few walnuts. They suddenly started to fall yesterday, and the squirrels simply haven't had time to gather them up yet. This is a typical black walnut in this woodlot. It's a good chunk of a tree. It tends to grow tall and straight because it grew inside a canopy. This is a well-established red squirrel walnut cache. You'll notice on the ground there are many holes in it, and you have to be quite careful not to sink to your ankles in the network of burrows which are underneath. There are walnuts carelessly strewn all over the ground, on top of the log, on top of the stump, and down the other side. It looks as though there was an uncommonly heavy fall of nuts from a tree right here. But if you look up, the tree is quite a long distance away. These nuts were brought here by a red squirrel. And I saw him running away when I came in. It's a pretty simple matter to pick them up from a location like this, and the squirrel doesn't seem to miss them. Last year, in anticipation of the improvement cut, I planted this area with about 10 gallons of walnuts. I went around with my planting stick and I put them in the ground quite properly, and to the best of my knowledge, none of them have come up yet. That could either mean they're not going to grow, or for some reason they decided to wait a year. But I haven't seen any in there, and I don't think that's promising. Perhaps it's a lack of sunlight, or perhaps there's too much wind off Newborough Lake. In any case, in these new clearings where there's a lot more sunlight and a little more shelter, I think the chances of having seedlings grow was considerably better. I made the mistake of filming my granddaughter hugging this tree. I doubt if I'll ever be able to cut this tree. For that reason, I don't think she'll let me. It's a good chunk. It's a super canopy tree, and I guess two stems have grown together, but it's pretty big. All right, now drop that into the hole. Okay, now it's a big nut. There we go. Now we get it down that far. Now jump on it. I don't think you're going to break it. There we go. It's in. That's all there is to it. You may wonder what happened to the logs from the harvest. Over the winter and into the spring, Brian Raisin cut and split the bulk of the logs into firewood for his customers. Our granddaughter Ada and I often visited Brian to watch him run his splitter. We also enjoyed talking to him and probably held him up more than we should have. Here you see some of the 200 trailer loads he hauled to his yard in Athens to dry for sale to his customers. Greg Beach hauled me out 4 dying cherry trees which showed some potential for lumber. Some of the cherry became firewood, but in the spring Scott Weber cut up the usable portions on his hobby mill. 245 board feet of clear black cherry was a bonus. Remember that long walnut tree behind Greg's skidder? He cut it into 4 logs whose ends I carefully painted with wax to protect them from the sun. A critical part of farm gate sales is having the equipment to load the logs, so this test was important. At length the walnuts sold to a buyer, and Phil Mayhew came with his wood miser to do the sawing on site. The butt log required some trimming in order to fit the mill. Everyone agreed that the clear, wide walnut boards were pretty great. The tree produced a bit over 1,000 board feet of material. Phil turned the forked log into perhaps the most valuable lumber of all, planks for burled walnut tabletops. I succumbed to the temptation and sprayed this pair with water for a photograph. YouTube has an influence, I guess. The buyers of the walnut continued through the basswood pile, adding almost 2,000 feet of secondary wood to their stock for cabinets, wainscoting, and panels. There wasn't much left over for sugarwood.